Okay, so welcome to the latest in a series of webinars brought to you in partnership with Wild Welfare and Global Animal Welfare. And we're very pleased to introduce Dr. Heather Bacon, who will be talking about animal welfare around the world. So not an easy subject to cover in 45 minutes, but over lunchtime or wherever you may be in the world. But yeah, it's animal welfare around the world, this webinar will be. Heather is a veterinarian and academic lead for the veterinary programme at the University of Central Lancashire. And she's worked internationally on veterinary education and animal welfare projects for over 15 years now, and previously responsible for developing and teaching veterinary and postgraduate students at the University of Edinburgh in animal welfare, behaviour and veterinary ethics. Additionally, she's worked with many charities and veterinary political organisations to develop veterinary education initiatives around the world, with a focus on improving welfare for captive and free-ranging wildlife, free-ranging dogs and cats. Heather has also delivered UK zookeeper training courses in animal health, behaviour and welfare. Previously, she's worked as the veterinary director at the Animals Asia Foundation, an NGO working to end the trade in bile-bear across Asia. So without further ado, I will hand over to Heather, where she can start her presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Simon. Hopefully everyone can hear me and can see my screen. So as Simon mentioned, this is a talk about animal welfare around the world, and because of that, there are some images that some people may find distressing. As he said, there's no kind of gratuitous images there, but just sort of as a bit of a content warning if you're not used to that kind of imagery or are particularly sensitive to it. So just to sort of introduce what we're going to cover in this presentation. Really, I'd like to keep it quite casual. If anyone has any comments or questions as we go through, then please do pop them in the Q&A. But really, this is just to give you a bit of an overview of some of my work and the experiences that I've had. It is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but just really focusing on a couple of key experiences that have really shaped and influenced the work that I do today, and the things that I've learned along the way, because I think sharing learning experiences is really important, and hopefully we can learn from each other and try not to make or repeat our mistakes, hopefully. And then just at the end, I'll be sharing what I think are some tips for engaging with people to improve animal welfare, no matter where they're working or what they're doing. So just to give you a bit of an overview, as Simon said, I've worked in many different countries and with many different species. Originally, I started out as a sort of normal vet in the UK in general practice. I have worked for zoos and animal welfare charities, and I've worked in a number of countries around the world. I've been involved now with legal cases, with writing guidance for veterinary organisations and animal welfare associations. And I guess in the more recent part of my career, I've been heavily involved in education, and that's something that I'm really passionate about. So I guess starting off really, as I said, I really became interested, I suppose, in wildlife when I was a vet student, and wildlife has remained a really important part of my career. Initially, that interest, I guess, developed from my interest in conservation, and I did a degree in conservation medicine as well. And this is a photograph of me as a vet student working on an African wild dog in the Wangi National Park in Zimbabwe. And that for me was a really exciting experience. I was very fortunate to have it, but a really exciting experience around seeing these incredible creatures in their natural habitat and understanding the impact that humans can have on animal health and animal welfare and on conservation in the field. This was an African wild dog that actually ended up being diagnosed with rabies. So we had darted this dog because it wasn't well, brought it back for treatment and supportive therapy. But unfortunately, the dog had a seizure and died and was later diagnosed with rabies, which is a problem for many wild carnivores, particularly in terms of their interactions with domestic dogs and disease control. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the work that's being done around the world in terms of rabies vaccination and eradication to protect wildlife populations and of course also human populations. So that was while I was a student still, and it was a really great experience to open my eyes to some of those big and complicated issues around disease transmission and the sort of human wildlife interfaces. And when I graduated in 2005, I decided I wanted to be a zoo vet, and I was really lucky in that my first job, by luck rather than anything else, ended up actually providing veterinary services to 3 quite large zoos in the UK and getting some really good experience under my belt around zoo and exotic animal medicine. But interestingly, that experience led me to decide that I did not want to be a zoo vet anymore. And not for any particular reason, you know, zoo animals are really cool animals, but what I found, I think, was that I was seeing problems that were often preventative through you know, if we maybe made different decisions around husbandry or made different decisions around behavioural management. And I found the lack of autonomy and power and input that I had as a vet into those situations a little bit frustrating. So I decided to pursue my interest in conservation, and that took me to Africa, where I did some work with a couple of different charities, but in particular the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, which is an incredible charity based in Rwanda. I also did some work in Congo. And that was a really formative experience for me because it made me realize how complicated the relationships are between humans and animals, and how our good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, and how making decisions around good animal welfare can be really challenging. So in the photograph on the top left, you can see there's a whole load of chimpanzees. These chimpanzees are actually in a sanctuary. It looks like they're all squashed up against the bar, but they're actually just being really nosy. I was a new person and they were all like, oh, hello, who are you? So these are all young juvenile chimpanzees that have been rescued from the trade in Africa. This was at a sanctuary in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And all of these chimps were being managed by a charity. So these are all animals that are rescued from trade. They often were animals that had actually been purchased by people who wanted to rescue them with those really good intentions. But unfortunately, in the pet trade, when you purchase an animal, and if there's no procedures in place to follow through in terms of criminal prosecutions for that illegal trafficking of the animal, unfortunately, all you're doing, you know, you're rescuing that individual animal, but you're also providing a market driver, a commercial incentive for the poacher that you've just bought the animal from to go out and do exactly the same thing over and over again. And so actually the charity that I worked for had a policy that we would often be presented with young chimps and young gorillas from poachers. And we had a policy which was heartbreaking, but also very pragmatic, that we would never pay for a young chimp or pay for a young gorilla, because we knew that if we did that, we might rescue that one individual, but what we were doing was setting that poacher up to go out and kill another family of chimps or another family of gorillas to get another baby to sell again. And so it was really important that we didn't support that market activity. So that really opened my eyes to sort of some of these ethical dilemmas we have around animal welfare and conservation, and some of the complexities of that decision making. And I really started to realize that human behavior is instrumental in changing the lives of animals. What we do and the decisions that we make have a really big impact on animals. You know, if we decide to buy a pet chimp, that has an impact not just on that individual animal, but on all of the family members of that animal, which will probably be killed in poaching of that chimpanzee. And the other thing I learned, this was my first sort of long stint in working in a country and a culture that was very different to where I'd grown up in the UK, was that a lot of the things that I had sort of taken for granted in my own upbringing and my own cultural experiences were actually not universal. So things that in the UK we might refer to as common sense are actually only common within a UK culture and context. And a really a non-animal example of that is around crossing the road in Rwanda. So when you're driving in Rwanda, you have to be quite careful because there's no street lighting. It's often very dark on some of the mountain roads. And there are lots of little villages and houses that sit right up against the roads. And it's totally normal for people just to walk straight out of their house, straight out the front door, straight onto the road. And they don't stop, they don't look, they don't listen. And the colleague that I was with when I was out there used to get incredibly frustrated by this and would sort of, get quite irate and say, what's wrong? Why don't these people have any common sense? And it's not that it's common sense. Stopping, looking and listen is something that is drilled into us as children in the UK. And we assume that everyone else does that. When you reach a road, you stop, you look, you listen before you cross. But actually, it's not common sense. It's a learning experience. And if you grow up in a culture where you don't have that learning experience, then it's never embedded into your cultural and societal norms, and it isn't common sense, and you don't automatically do it. And so that was quite a formative lesson for me, because it made me realize that actually a lot of the things we take for granted, a lot of the things that we think are common sense, a lot of the things that we think are normal are actually only normal within a very narrow cultural context. And that recognizing that is really important when you're working overseas, because cultural norms vary so much from place to place. So in 2007, I moved to China. And really this changed my life. So I moved, as Simon mentioned in my bio, to be the veterinary director of the Animals Asia Foundation. Started off as a veterinary surgeon for them and managed to stick around for a couple of years. And again, this international overseas experience, working in a culture that was very different from my own, working in a situation and environment that was very different from what I was used to, really shaped some of my perspectives. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time to tell you a little bit about the Animals Asia Foundation. It's an incredible charity, works across a whole range of different welfare issues, primarily around ending the trade in bear bile and bile farming, but also on cat and dog welfare and supporting responsible pet ownership, supporting pets as therapy programs, and on captive animal welfare, captive wildlife welfare, improving veterinary training and animal welfare standards across a whole range of industry. And the focus really is to bring about long-term change and positive change for animals. So just to give you a bit of background and context, because I think understanding some of the sort of animal welfare challenges that you might see or might be involved in working with overseas is really important. There's often a lot of misunderstandings around some of animal uses that are different to how we might typically use animals, from my UK perspective, I guess. So bear bile farming is a legal industry, a domestic industry in China and Korea, and it's illegal but ongoing in Vietnam. And I think one thing that's really important to emphasize here is that bear bile does have proven medicinal and therapeutic benefits. Quite often we dismiss traditional Asian medicine as being voodoo or not, rubbish and not based on any evidence. And that might be the case for some animal products that are used in traditional Asian medicine. For example, there are no known medicinal benefits of rhino horn or tiger bone. But bear bile is different. Bear bile does have some therapeutic benefits. Now, those therapeutic benefits can be easily replaced by other alternatives that do not require bears to be hunted or farmed or experience the terrible welfare that they experience on farms. But I think it's really important that when we are engaging in animal welfare issues, that we are honest about the issues and the challenges that we face, and we don't sort of make assumptions around some of the things that we're dealing with, even if those truths are a little bit uncomfortable. So bear bile does have medicinal properties, but those medicinal properties can easily be replaced. Now, bears on farms are kept in pretty awful conditions, and they are in very small cages a lot of the time. They're highly restricted. They have a surgery in their abdomen to allow for bile to be extracted from their gallbladder, and that extraction site, that fistula, is usually horribly infected, and the gallbladder gets horribly infected because it's a channel that is open to the outside world. It's not a natural or normal channel. So we have severe behavioural deprivation for these poor bears. We have them kept in a really inappropriate nutritional state. They have almost no freedom, and they have this horrible sort of infection and ongoing injury to their abdomens. So just to give you an illustration of that, these are images from Animals Asia. This would be the belly of the bear, the sort of lower abdomen, and then there's an artificial surgery is performed to access the gallbladder. And that means that bile that would normally be in the gallbladder, comes from the liver into the gallbladder and is used for digestion, is instead collected here. Now, of course, because this is an abnormal fistula and an abnormal connection to the outside world, we don't normally have a hole in our abdominal wall, then the body does try to heal over this channel, and that means that traditionally different things were used to keep that connection open. So things like stainless steel catheters and latex catheters, and were implanted. These are all illegal methods of bile extraction. Another thing that you might have seen perhaps in photos or videos is this use of metal jackets, and that's to stop the bear from interfering with the fistula, because as you can probably imagine, having that fistula open to the outside world is painful, and having a catheter in there is painful and irritating, and the bears want to try and remove those, and so the metal jackets offer a protection to the extraction site to prevent the bear from interfering with them. Now, the sort of reddened tissue that you can see in the images here, these are gallbladders, and it's really important to note that these are really abnormal, thickened and infected gallbladders. So just to give you a frame of reference, the left-hand side is a normal bear gallbladder from a bear that has not had bile extraction performed. You can see it's really thin-walled, it's almost transparent, and the bile is sort of a clear yellowy green colour within it. And then on the right, and in the previous images, you saw gallbladders from bears that have had bile extraction. You can see how thickened these gallbladders are. They're much, much thicker walls, as the body has built up scar tissue against the chronic infection and inflammation. This is actually an abscess in the bottom of a gallbladder with a stone, a gallstone forming, and these are very painful. So this whole process of infection and inflammation and gallstone formation is going to be very painful, and it doesn't just stay within the gallbladder. These changes also track up into the biliary system and into the liver, and predispose bears to a whole range of awful pathologies that they can develop over time. So there are lots and lots of welfare issues associated with bear bile farming. So in addition to that, those kind of gallbladder pathologies, there are problems around nutrition. This bear has a hernia in the abdomen because of the weakness in the abdominal wall from that previous surgery. Lots of eye problems and blindness in these bears because of the chronic infection and inflammation in the gallbladder. What that does is set up a cascade of inflammation throughout the body, and a circulation of those kind of bacteria all through the body, and they can seed to other organs and cause problems, and inflammation in the eyes, which can cause blindness. We also see problems associated with how bears are treated and managed on the farm. So they may well have lost their teeth, either because they've been biting at the bars of their cages in frustration, or because perhaps they've suffered trauma and traumatic injury from people who have hit them and damaged those teeth. And if you've ever had a dental problem, then that's obviously really painful. We also see problems associated with how bears come onto farms. So some farms breed, but a lot of the time cubs are trafficked up from Southeast Asia across the border into China and then used on the farms. And we see evidence of that, like in the top right photograph, where we can see this is a snare wound from a bear that was rescued by Animals Asia. And then just lots of general sort of problems that bears have with their skin and their coats and their claws from being kept in these tiny cages in these pretty awful circumstances. So you can see that we're dealing with a range of pathologies, and for me as a vet working across this range of challenges and problems, this was an enormous learning curve, and I was really lucky that I worked with a fantastic team of people who were really experienced, and we were able to share that learning experience and to help these bears to give them the medical care that they needed, to give them the behavioural support that they needed, and to support them in their rehabilitation. And bears are incredible. So in these photos, you can see these are all ex-bile farm bears, and you would not know it from looking at these images because they just look like normal, happy, healthy bears. And really, that's a testament to the incredible work that's done by Animals Asia. And these bears are all used for educational purposes. So in a very controlled and informed way, visitors are able to visit the bears in the sanctuary and learn about bear bile farming, learn about some of the challenges that those bears experience on the farms and the significant welfare problems, and then to see them behaving normally, behaving like bears, and the transformation that they have undergone with appropriate husbandry and veterinary support, and understand that the situations on farms are not normal or appropriate for these bears, and that they are a significant welfare problem. And that helps people, I think, to make more informed choices when they do go to a pharmacy and they are offered medical products. And I remember one thing that I used to hear quite often is but surely it's obvious that that you shouldn't be buying bear bile, that this is going to be a welfare problem for these bears. But again, it's only obvious if it's within your cultural framework, your cultural norms. So I think when we go to the pharmacy and we buy a packet of paracetamol, we don't think about anything about that packet of paracetamol, where it's come from. It's just a product that we buy in a packet. We don't think about how it's developed or what testing has been undergone or any of those things. We just buy the packet of paracetamol because we want it for our headache. And I think often that's the case with traditional Asian medicine as well. Most of the horrors of bear bile farming and other types of wildlife farming occur behind closed doors. There isn't a lot of public information around them. And so I think it can be quite easy to, be handed a packet of pills or, a packet of capsules and not really understand the implications of what it is you're buying. And that's why education and raising awareness around animal welfare is so important. So as part of my experience in China, I was happened to be living there in 2008 when, unfortunately, the province of Sichuan, where the bear sanctuary is based, experienced a pretty terrifying earthquake. So the Wenchuan earthquake was measured at 8 on the Richter scale, and that's a pretty severe quake. It occurred on May the 12th in 2008, and over 69,000 people died, and many, many hundreds of thousands more were affected, displaced, and lost their homes. And of course, the primary concern when that happened was to ensure people were safe and taken care of and housed appropriately in refugee camps and given the support that they needed. But what arose out of that was also a concern around the dogs and cats that these people owned. And we became aware very quickly that people were risking their own lives to go back into their apartments. We were still suffering a lot of aftershocks, and it was an incredibly dangerous situation. But people were risking their own lives to go back into their apartments to feed their pet cats or their pet dogs, because those animals were not allowed in the refugee camps because of concerns around disease control. And that really highlighted to me the strong emotional bond between people and their pets. And for a long time, pet ownership in China was quite a controversial subject. It wasn't something that was encouraged. It's only really been since the 1990s that pet ownership has really started to take off. So it's a relatively new sort of cultural experience, but it's definitely a very strong experience in the same way that all of us, I'm sure, have experienced that bond between, with our own pets. And definitely we saw that in Wenchuan. And one particular example of that was this little dog, Tudo. So as part of the work that we did to support local people through the earthquake, we ran a fostering program where people who were living in refugee camps could hand over their pet dogs and cats to us. And we worked with a local shelter, a local dog and cat shelter, and supported them in developing facilities to foster these pet dogs and cats, took notes of the owners and who they were, with the idea being that once they were back on their feet, the owners could then reach out and collect their pet dogs and cats. And that was actually a really successful program. It worked really well. We were able to offer that fostering support and reunite almost all of those dogs and cats with their original owners, which was incredibly rewarding. But this is Tudo. Tudo was a little dog owned by this gentleman here, and they lived in a little house in a place called Dujianyang. And on the morning of the earthquake, Tudo was sort of just behaving normally, minding his own business, hanging out with his owner, and all of a sudden started barking furiously at his owner, darting towards the door, coming back, barking furiously at his owner again, darting towards the door. And then eventually Tudo ran outside and his owner followed him outside to see what he was barking at. It's very, very unusual behaviour for Tudo. And just a few minutes later, the earthquake hit and this man's house was destroyed. So he brought Tudo to us. Sorry, the story always makes me well up a little bit. It was very sweet. He brought Tudo to us because Tudo was all that he had left. And if Tudo hadn't behaved in that way, then he would have been in his house when the earthquake hit. And I think it's a really lovely story because you hear about those stories, you know, you read them in the newspapers or you see them on the internet, and you always think, well, you know, maybe that's not true, or maybe it's been misrepresented, and you know. But hearing this, you know, directly from the horse's mouth, I was the vet that did a health check on Tudo and made sure he was fit and healthy, gave him his rabies vaccination, and then we fostered him for a year. And, or in fact, it wasn't even a year. I think it was about 6 or 7 months he stayed with us. And then as soon as his owner was able to, he came back and Tudo was reunited. So that was a really lovely story, I think, and just a really nice way of highlighting to me how important that relationship is. You know, these are people that have lost everything and they are risking their own lives to feed their pets, to make sure their pets are safe. And those animals are also, you know, helping their owners out in a reciprocal way. And I think that's really lovely. So all of these experiences really made me start to reflect on a lot of the judgments that we make about other cultures and other people. And even now, unfortunately, I think you'll see on social media quite a lot of stereotyping around how other people live or the choices that they make or other cultures. And those stereotypes are often really unhelpful. They often create something that we describe as othering. So, you know, that sort of them and us mentality. Oh, we would never do that, but they do that. And that's really, really unhelpful. If we are working together to change animal welfare, then we need to work together and we need to talk to each other. We need to understand each other. We need to focus on what we've got in common as people. And often that's a surprising amount. So I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is always challenge your belief systems, challenge your own attitudes, challenge your own perspectives, and think about, well, why do I believe that? What's it based on? And is it really true? Because quite often we make a lot of assumptions and you can't effectively engage with people if you're making assumptions. So that really leads me on to the sort of work that I do now, which is around human behaviour change and improving animal welfare. So I moved back to the UK about 10 years ago and was lucky enough to start working for the Jean Marchig International Centre for Animal Welfare Education at the University of Edinburgh, where I worked until recently, until earlier this year. And my job there really focused on animal welfare education and veterinary education on an international basis. And we collaborated with universities, so different vet schools and veterinary associations around the world to improve training for vets and vet nurses and therefore to improve the lives of animals experiencing those veterinary services. And really to try and encourage vets to be the advocates for good animal welfare. So animal welfare is a really interesting area. I think there are lots and lots and lots of different definitions of animal welfare. This is a definition from EASA, the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, on the left-hand side of the screen. But basically, I think what's really important is that we consider the animal's psychological and behavioural needs as well as its physical needs. We need to look at the animal's whole experience. And as vets, we're often trained very much to focus on that kind of physical health approach, but what we need to consider in addition to that is the animal's behavioural health and its mental and emotional health, because they're also really, really important. And then when we talk about welfare, I think quite often we talk about welfare as if it's automatically a good thing or it's automatically a bad thing. But it's really important to recognise that welfare exists on a spectrum. And so it has a valence, it has a value. It can be really good. It can also be really poor, and it can be adequate. And different aspects of welfare might be at different places along that spectrum at different times. So, for example, you might have an animal that has a great environment and really good sort of behavioural opportunities, but has a poor diet, and therefore its nutritional welfare is not very good. So we have to look at lots and lots of different aspects of welfare to build up that whole animal picture. And that's where composite welfare assessments are really helpful in giving us that objective and overall assessment. And so I learned a lot more about animal welfare in a more formal university setting, started doing some research around animal welfare, and I've done quite a bit of work around producing guidance for animal welfare in different contexts around the world. So I feel like I've learned a lot about animal welfare. I think it's one of those areas where we're always continually learning, and that learning process is ongoing, and that's something that I really enjoy. But one of the big things, I guess, reflecting back on some things I said earlier, is that animal welfare is really dependent on what we do as humans. You know, we make choices for animals, our behaviours impact animals. And so if we can change human behaviour, then we can change and hopefully improve the welfare of animals. Now, I've done a lot of work around the world with different universities and different organisations and charities. And I hear people talk a lot about education, and education is important. I work in education, so I kind of have to say that. But I think very much when we are talking about education, we are thinking about knowledge transfer. We're thinking about, I have some information and I'm going to talk at you. And at the end of my talking, you will have the same information that I have and you will be educated. And actually, that's a really simplistic way of looking at education, and it's not a very helpful way of looking at education, because also our behaviour and our knowledge about a subject are not always related. It's a much more complex system than that, and that's kind of what I want to finish up with talking about. So this is something called the Combi Model of human behaviour change, and this looks at all of the things that influence our ability to behave in a particular way. Now, the first part of that is our capability. So this is our psychological or physical ability to enact the behaviour. Can we physically change? Can we physically do something? Do we have the knowledge? So that knowledge is important. We have to know what we're doing. And do we actually want to change our behaviour? Are we capable of changing our behaviour? The second part is the motivation. So what kinds of things might also influence our behaviour? So that can be a fear of judgment, or anxiety around doing something different, a fear of blame, might be concerns around peer pressure or doing something differently to how we've been brought up or to our local or regional cultures. So those kind of emotional mechanisms can really affect what behaviours we choose to do or don't choose to do. And then our motivation, our sort of, well, yes, I really want to get this, so I'm going to do it. I really want to run a marathon, so I'm going to train every week. So these are all the sort of emotional and attitudinal aspects that influence our behaviour. And then the last one is opportunity. So the physical and social environment that enables our behaviour. Do we have the resources? Do we have the time? Do we have the money? Is our environment set up for success? Are we actually able to do that based on those external factors? And all of these things affect our ability to behave in a certain way. And therefore, if we want to engage in effective education, we have to consider all of these things as part of our educational process. We can't just go and tell somebody what to do and assume that they have the motivation and the lack of fear or concern in order to do it, and that they have the resources to be able to implement our advice. It's not just enough to give somebody knowledge. We have to consider all of these different factors in their ability to be able to change their behaviour. So as I said, capability improves on, capability is sort of that knowledge and information transfer, and that includes things like engagement, improving understanding and collaboration, and in particular, I think co-creation of educational opportunities. So I actually really dislike this sort of talking at people. It's very strange when I can't even see anyone because there's no feedback at all. I'm usually much more interactive than this. But I think it's really important that we work together to exchange knowledge and to understand. I've certainly learned so much about constraints and barriers and cultural problems and beliefs from other people. And that's been a really important part of my own educational journey. And then motivations, so things that might influence our motivation, things like our ethics, our own personal viewpoint around what we think is right or wrong, you know, our own kind of moral compass. And then there are lots of things that influence our decision making that we won't even be aware of on a daily basis. So your sex, whether you're male or female, will influence your decision making, your culture, and that might be your geographic culture. So I mentioned earlier about being from the UK versus being from some of the other countries that I've worked in. Obviously different cultures there, but there are also institutional cultures. So if you work within an organization, you may find that there is a cultural norm or a way of doing something within that organization that is actually inhibits your behavior, or you know, you don't want to challenge that because you're worried about challenging that organizational culture. And our familiarity with animals is also something that can change our motivation. So we are much more likely to be comfortable working with species or changing those species that we're familiar with, that we have that sort of knowledge and understanding around. And how we perceive those animals in terms of their intelligence and their sociality, and their level of cognition also influences how we perceive and treat them. So just a sort of example of familiarity and perception. In the UK, we think of kangaroos as being this, lovely, fluffy, cute animals that hop around the Australian desert, and we only see them in zoos really. But in Australia, obviously, the kangaroos are cold. They can be a pest species. They can cause road traffic accidents. There's a much more sort of nuanced viewpoint of kangaroos in Australia than we in the UK might appreciate or understand. Because we don't have that sort of direct connection to them. Other things that might influence our motivation are aesthetics. So basically how cute an animal is. We're much more likely to want to change things or improve things for animals that we are empathetic towards, that we find cute. And then how related they are to us. So we're much more likely to be empathetic towards animals like chimpanzees, for example, or other ape species, than we might be towards this fish that you can see in the photograph here. And then if we have situations where you have aesthetics and relatedness combined, then your response to this fish in this photograph will be very different to your response to this dog here. And that is an emotional response, and it's very difficult to control that or change it. And I'm not suggesting that you should or need to change it, but you will almost certainly have a different emotional response. And just being aware of that is really important, because we're far more likely to campaign for the dog welfare than we are for the fish welfare. But is their experience really any different? Or is that just because of our own human biases affecting our motivations to affect that change? And then the role of animals in our society will also affect our motivation. So I mentioned earlier about bears and bear farming, and often people in the West are horrified about that whole process, and how can you keep bears on farms? And again, that boils down to sort of how we perceive bears and what bears mean to us. And we're raised with Paddington and Winnie the Pooh and all of those kind of bear stories. Every kid has a teddy bear. But that's not the same in every country, and it's not the same in every culture. And If bears are producers of medicine, then perhaps they're seen more as a livestock animal, a production animal. And if we think perhaps about how bears are treated in some of those farm situations, and then we think about how we treat our production animals and the experiences that they have within those production systems, then actually are those two things significantly different? Okay, we might not perform surgery so much in our dairy cows, for example, but we do perform castration and teeth clipping of our pigs. We perform castration and tail docking of lambs. You know, those are aversive surgical procedures that are often done without anaesthetic. And so, you know, there are certainly parallels there, but because they're normal within our culture, we don't think about them and challenge them in the way that we challenge that use of animals in other cultures. So again, it's very easy for us to criticize other cultures or to judge other cultures, but actually I think often there are parallels within our own use and treatment of animals. It's just that we often don't reflect on that. So it's important to do that. And then opportunities. Do we have the opportunity for changing our behaviour? And I think what I've learned along the way is that the UK is a really weird place when it comes to animal welfare. We like to think that we're normal because this is normal for us. We grew up here. This is you know, our cultural norm. But actually, if you look back at the history of law in the UK, then the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act came into force in 1822. So, you know, a long time ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, pretty much now. And this act made it illegal to beat your cattle. So that's good. That's a good piece of legislation, I think. And then in 1824, the RSPCA was formed. So the RSPCA is the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So this is the first sort of UK charity focused on preventing cruelty to animals. And then in 1849, the Cruelty to Animals Act was passed through Parliament. So again, another really important piece of animal welfare legislation. Then in 1884, the NSPCC was formed. This is the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. It took 60 years for the UK to develop a charity against cruelty to children after it had developed a charity against cruelty to animals. There's a 60-year gap between those two charities coming about. That tells you quite a lot about the priorities for animal welfare in the UK versus human welfare to some extent. We did then also get the first piece of legislation that protected children against cruelty. Again, it came after animal protection legislation. We get the Protective Animals Act, 1911, then the Children and Young Persons Act, 1933, and so on and so on. But you can see, I think, the point that I'm trying to make, which is that really, in terms of priorities, these are weird priorities. You know, I love animals. I work in animal welfare. I have committed my personal and professional life to improving the lives of animals. But even so, I can see that these are weird priorities. And understanding that has been helpful for me, because I can also understand that other countries might not have this sort of same set of cultural priorities. There are many countries around the world where the lives of children and their protection has been legislated for, the lives of people and their protection has been legislated for well before animal protection legislation has been enacted. And I don't think that that's an unreasonable state of affairs. And so I think it's really important when we're looking to other countries or working with people from other cultures, that we also understand where we've come from and some of the quirks and idiosyncrasies around our own culture. So if you grow up with this as your cultural norm, then yes, your opportunities for enacting change in animal welfare are probably good, because you're probably working within a really robust legal framework that helps you improve the welfare of animals in the UK. That's not always going to be the case in other places. Okay, so the Combi model, I think, is helpful in understanding why animal welfare standards might vary around the world, and why people might have different capabilities, motivations and opportunities for improving animal welfare. But I think that most people, when we address those factors, do want to improve the lives of animals. And I'm just going to finish up with a very short video. So I think I'm probably running over time, but I've got hopefully a couple of minutes. So I'm just going to play this for you. Okay, so that's I think a really lovely little video. It was produced by a Chinese documentary film crew. And the thing that I really like about it is the emphasis on teamwork and collaboration. And I think it really shows that we make lots of assumptions sometimes about what people might think or how they might feel about a particular industry like bear bar farming. But you can see in that video that everybody involved in that process was passionate and enthusiastic and empathetic and caring, and just wanted to do the best that they could do to help the animals that we were all there to help. And that's, I think, the really important thing about animal welfare worldwide, is that we don't make assumptions about other people's motivations, and that we are always open to those opportunities for collaboration. So in terms of my sort of next steps, I think animal welfare is fundamental to veterinary education. And I think regardless of whether you're working in the veterinary sphere or you're working in the charity sphere or anywhere else, I think it's really important that we are inclusive, that we are understanding of each other, and that we collaborate to improve animal welfare. And I think as much as we can share that message, then we can keep improving the lives of animals around the world. So I think the barriers to improving animal welfare aren't always the ones that we think that they are, and I think it's really important that as people we work together to improve the lives of animals, because we do all have the power to make a difference. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. Apologies, I think I've probably run over a little bit.
Thanks, Heather. I don't know if it was my end or it was just generally. I think there were just some connectivity issues with the video.
Okay, no worries.
But the link was there, I saw. So yeah, I managed to get through the whole presentation without feeling emotional, and then you had to play that. So but yeah, lots of amazing stuff said there, and I think quite a lot will resonate with everybody on the call, and I think particularly talking about different cultures and in different contexts as well. So
definitely. Yeah.
I wonder, first question for you is, if you could identify one key moment in your career, what might it be that's had the most significant impact on you? Or is there too many to mention?
Yeah, I don't think there has been one. I think it probably came across a little bit in that presentation that there's been lots of moments. I think you don't always recognize them at the time, but there's been lots of moments in my career, and there's many others that I didn't mention, where it sort of changed my perspective on things, or I've been challenged to think about things in a different way. And I think one thing that I've learned is that those challenges, when you're in them, are often, they're quite difficult to sort of somebody challenges your thinking, or you're in a situation where you're a bit stressed. But I think what's really important is that we do reflect. Sort of term reflection's become quite trendy recently, but I do think it's really important that we reflect on what we're doing and why we're doing, and what other people are doing and why they might be doing that, and sort of look for those similarities rather than looking for the differences, and always be open to changing our own behaviour. I think that's the other thing that I've learned is, just because we've done something for a long time, it doesn't mean we're doing it the best way that we can. So always being open to, every day's a school day, I think.
Mm.
All right. Thank you. We've got a question in the Q&A. This is from Dr. Nalia. Hello, Dr. Nalia. I'm sorry I can't see you, but it's good to have you on the call. He's asking, after a bear's been rescued and they've spent their lives or a very long time in the bear bile cages, can they live together with other bears, and is it possible to sort of integrate them? Sorry, I can't say integrate them. Thank you. Into living with other bears.
Yeah. So I think that was probably another sort of defining moment, learning curve for me, was really just seeing how incredible bears are as animals. I think it's probably because of their sort of hibernation physiology, but their abilities to sort of cope with those really deprived situations and then be rehabilitatable is really incredible. You don't really see that in many other species. And absolutely they will definitely form social groups and friendships. The integration process Nick also knows a lot about, but it's a very long process, and it's really about setting them up for success. So we want to make sure that they're physically healthy, that then they don't have pain, because that can affect their behavior. We want them to be in an environment where they have all of the resources that they need, so they're well fed and they've got lots of enrichment and they've got lots of activities to occupy them. And if they're set up for success in that environment, then bears will often be very, very sociable and get a lot of pleasure from playing with each other and wrestling with each other and having those social interactions. So bears are not a solitary animal, as a lot of people might think. but what they are is they're resource driven. So if they're kept in a situation where they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough food, or they don't have enough enrichment, or they don't have enough space, then they will compete for resources, and that can lead to aggression. But if we can provide them with enough resources, then they will share and enjoy that social experience that they have. So.
Well said. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is that they dictate the process and the speed at which they will integrate as well, as individuals. What individual animal has had the most impact on your life and career, Heather?
Individual animal. Oh, that's really difficult. There's been loads. I feel like I'm still learning. I think we all learn from the animals that we share our lives with, but I am still learning. I would say if I had to pick one, it would probably be my first dog, because when I got my first dog, I was quite young, and she was a lovely dog. But I think it's just the sort of part of the culture and the time that I grew up in the UK. The ways that we kept dogs in those days were quite different. She was confined to the kitchen during the day, and she had to be during the night, and she had to be outside during the day. There was still a lot of misunderstandings around dog behaviour and the use of dominance in dog training, which we now know obviously is not not sort of a valid scientific approach to dog training. And there was, I think, so much misunderstandings around dog behaviour. And I think what I learned from her was that actually you have to have that individual relationship with that individual animal, and not always listen to what everyone else is telling you about how you should keep dogs and what the traditional way is of keeping them. And actually, she helped me to learn that, some of the traditional dog training stuff I'd learned was a load of nonsense, and that there was a better way of doing things. And I think, challenging the status quo is important to improve animal welfare.
Right. I mean, the presentation was fantastic, and it's really interesting about the cultural differences and similarities as well that we sort of take for granted, and behaviour change, and how we get that behaviour change in people and students. So that sort of leads to a question, sort of couple of aspects of the question, I guess. So like veterinary medicine, especially in zoos or captive facilities, like zoos and sanctuaries, was very much health centric. So with students now and the work you do now, how do you see that changing with students, and how they're being taught about not just the physical health of the animal, but the psychological health and the general welfare in vet training?
I have to say, I think we've got a long way to go. The veterinary medical curriculum is still, and does need to be, very focused on physical health. That is the mainstay of the work that we do. But I think that there is growing awareness within the profession of the importance of behavioural health. Just worked with the World Small Animal Veterinary Association and the Federation of Vets of Europe around a position statement on behavioural issues in companion animals. We've just had the new British Small Animal Veterinary Association textbook of practical animal welfare published. So I think that these are all examples of the growing interest within the veterinary profession around animal welfare, and around that being much more than just that physical health. We have a sort of European College of Veterinary Behaviourists now. It's a much more sort of professional specialisation within the profession in Europe. So I think understanding all of those sort of different elements and that sort of understanding is growing. But I do think that there's probably also a generational change on the cards. There's still plenty of vets who are more traditional perhaps in their outlook, and who consider behaviour and emotions even to be anthropomorphic, whereas what animal welfare science shows us is that animals do experience emotional states, and they do have that emotional capability. So I think the most important thing we can do is to train vets who have enquiring minds and who are able to keep themselves up to date with current research in the behaviour and welfare field, and apply that information in their practice, because it doesn't matter what you teach a vet at vet school, you can't teach them everything that they will need to know for their whole career. So I think just generating that sort of the attitude towards self-directed learning and wanting that, striving to improve our knowledge is important.
Excellent, thank you. Have we got any other questions, Nick, or we because we're just over an hour now?
Yeah, I think we are. Joan, I saw a hand up for Joan in the chat, so I've just said, could you pass that through to the Q&A, Joan, if you have a question?
Okay, just waiting for it comes through.
Whilst we're just waiting on that, Heather, just a question, because you've talked wonderfully about collaboration and challenging the norms, and you know, the fact that we've all got more in common than we have not in common. What do you think have been some of the biggest challenges, or you think is that the fact that people make assumptions to improving animal welfare in your experience, and do you think it's just all situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies depending on the situation. I think often when, you know, people work in animal welfare because they're passionate about animals, and I think that's a fantastic thing. But I think also that passion can sometimes mean that we don't reflect on our own motivations and behaviors as much, you know, because we're right and we're doing good, and often we are, but I think we only know that we're doing good if we assess and evaluate that, and we can show that we're doing good. I think also sometimes we make assumptions that because our intentions are good, then we will definitely have good animal welfare outcomes, and that's not always the case. So we can certainly have really good intent. You know, I've worked in situations where the intentions are really good, but the experience for the animal is actually pretty terrible. Mm-hmm. And so I think separating our own emotional desire to do a good job and stopping and looking at the animal's experience is really important, because yeah, sometimes that pursuit of wanting to do good can actually create a welfare cost for that animal.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions coming through, Si.
Okay, right. Well, yeah, I think we've kept everyone long enough, and so thank you again to Heather for a really interesting talk, and yeah, it's been quite eye-opening as well. Even though I've worked in this field for a long time, you still learn things, and the behaviour change. The Combi B was quite interesting, yeah. So I'm definitely looking more into that. So thank you again, Heather, and thank you for joining us. The next webinar in this series is on the 17th of December with Dr. Sam Ward from Nottingham-Trent University. So please keep an eye on the Global Animal Welfare and the Wild Welfare websites and social media for the next webinar. And please do connect with both our organisations on social media to keep track of all our projects and news. Oh, no, it's just comments coming through, so I thought it was another question. Right, okay, well, thanks again, and we will end it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.